what exactly is contemplation? And then how does it invite transformation? I'm really working with that.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you asked that because I still remember this one time looking at the TV and seeing this ad, and these fellas in business suits were standing around saying, okay, we're going to contemplate our next marketing effort. You know, and I think, oh heavens, how words get so used up, misused, and we all are thinking something different. And of course, we hear that today all over the place when all the various political divisions say one thing and we all interpret it differently. So thank you for this question. Contemplation simply is a form of prayer. Contemplation awakens in us a new awareness of the divine indwelling. Cynthia Bourgeois says it rather well. She says, when I go into myself, my center, my own being and the divine being become more and more mysteriously interwoven. My own nature, who I am in my core, and the divine being who is also within me become more and more mysteriously interwoven. So contemplation invites us to that more direct experience of God. Now, when I was growing up, we didn't learn contemplation. In fact, contemplation was seen as a very special gift given to the few, and they usually then entered cloistered religious congregations. And they were sort of away from the world. And for many people, they thought contemplation was passivity. Well, that's not really true, and it certainly is not how we're living it out today. But in fact, way back in our history, the early desert fathers and monks were already practicing contemplation. And in this last century, it really has started coming back to more of our consciousness. And some of these names you might recognize. John Main, who brought back the mantra, the breathing technique. Thomas Keating, I suspect a lot of you have heard of and or are followed centering prayer. Thomas Merton, of course, who was so essential. And for religious congregations, back in the 60s, there was a house of prayer movement that actually two of the IHM sisters of Monroe, Margaret Brennan and Ann Chester, really helped to lead. So Thomas Merton was very key in that, to get active apostolic religious returning to that contemplative source. Evelyn Underhill, you might not know, she's an English Christian Catholic, but she has written extensively on mysticism. And then Cynthia Bourgeois, a modern day mystic, Episcopal priest that I've already mentioned. But they started to bring forward again the Christian contemplative tradition. Now, there are many reasons why contemplation was not taught through the centuries to the average person. But I do think one of the reasons it's returning, well, actually two reasons. One is I think there is such a hunger today for spirituality, a spirituality that can make sense of what we know through science about our world today. It's a spirituality that is saying, look, we don't want to be just isolated. My achievements alone are not enough to give me meaning. And so what we're doing is we're really coming out of the extremes of what we have come to call modernity, the great individualism. And we really are needing to see that there's more to life. Look at the suicide rates that are happening among young people as well as older. And the second reason is because I believe with the onset of psychology in the 20th and 21st centuries, we have come to understand the importance of psychology with our spiritual development. As one enters into that process of discovering one's true self, one has to have a pretty healthy ego and must understand some of the implications. And so that integration, I think, has really helped us to be able to say it can be for everyone. In fact, Evelyn Underhill wrote in the 1950s that mysticism is the birthright of every Christian. And I think now we are able to really invite people into that process. So what might be the key characteristics of contemplative prayer? It's a prayer without words and without images. So some of you might, if you haven't done this, might think this is really, it's sort of empty, right? Like you're just sort of empty your brain. But it's not quite, it's not an emptiness. but it's another way of saying it is a non-discursive form of prayer. You don't want to use your intellect or your emotions. Now, not because those aren't good, they're just different. And they already bring that developed interpretive lens to your experience. If you remember in my little sharing of what drew me, there came a time when the prayers that I was saying were stumbling blocks to me, because the kind of interpretation of every one of those words was very difficult for me. And so I couldn't do it. So in contemplation, you let that go. You really are entering a much freer, in some ways, experience. You simply enter into the presence of the divine. You enter into a deep stillness and try to quiet your mind. You don't look for answers to your problems, and you don't wait to hear a response from God. Now, that's very different than how some of us learn to pray. And I remember often praying, sort of not betting with God exactly, but it was like, if I do this, then will you do this? And I saw that, so that must mean I can do this. And it was this kind of, it was a very useful prayer for me at the time, but it certainly was me trying to control God in all of that marvelous prayer time. So here you don't look for answers to problems. It doesn't happen when you're in your contemplative sitting. Rather, you become totally present to this moment. And we know how hard that is, especially even during this COVID time, when you might be home, sometimes more alone. You might be more connected with all your devices because everyone's contacting you. I mean, a lot of you, I'm sure, are like zoomed out. So I appreciate you coming on today. But we have to become present to this moment. We don't have to worry about what we could have done, should have done, would have done. We're present to the now. You simply surrender to God working within you. You are moving from ordinary awareness to spiritual awareness to divine awareness. One of the questions was around Lectio Divina, and let me just address that for a minute in contemplation. For those of you who practice Lectio, you know contemplation is the fourth sort of phase of that process. You begin by reading the scripture, then you meditate on it, using your imagination, using your thought processes. Then you go to oratio, where you actually let those words and images touch your heart, and then you express it in words as a prayer. And the final stage is that of contemplation, where your mind and emotions are stilled and you rest in the presence of the divine. Lectio has been a long tradition, especially within the Benedictine monasteries. However, in our own sort of broader Catholic tradition, it got sort of stuck in meditatio, the meditation. And probably that was when we thought of contemplation as a very special gift, an infused gift. And so now today we see it in a much different context. So Lectio is a marvelous way to bring you to contemplation. So contemplation is a process and it takes time. Someone always asked, how long does it take? Well, are there benchmarks? Well, I laugh a little bit because I think it takes a long time letting God be God in you. And a lot of it depends on personality. You know, your Myers-Briggs, your Enneagram number, and the seriousness of our intent to explore how our inner life as we keep falling deeply into God's love. As far as a benchmark, well, that's hard, but I think it's connected to the transformative process.